The dust kicked up from the boy's bare feet as he stumbled through the scorching Arizona desert, his thin frame casting a shadow barely visible against the unforgiving terrain. Nobody in the small town of Red Mesa knew his name, and nobody cared to ask. He was just another vagrant, another mouth that didn't belong, another problem that needed solving. But what they didn't know was that this 13-year-old boy carried a secret that would shake the very foundations of their tight-knit community. And the old rancher who would soon call him son held the key to a mystery that had been buried for over a decade. The boy's stomach growled with a hunger so fierce it felt like claws tearing at his insides. 3 days without food had left him weak, desperate, and willing to take risks that his clearer mind would have avoided. The general store on Main Street seemed like his only option, its wooden shelves lined with bread, canned goods, and hope. He waited until old Mrs. Henderson turned her back to help another customer. Then his trembling hands reached for a loaf of bread. The paper crinkled softly, but in the silence of that moment, it might as well have been thunder. "Stop right there, you little thief." Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the air like a blade. Her weathered finger pointed at him with the accuracy of someone who had spent 60 years watching for trouble. The boy froze, the bread still clutched in his dirty hands, his green eyes wide with terror and shame. Other customers turned to stare, their faces a mixture of disgust and curiosity. This wasn't the first time Red Mesa had dealt with vagrants, but something about this boy was different, though none of them could quite put their finger on what it was. Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived within minutes, his heavy boots echoing against the wooden floorboards as he surveyed the scene. The boy stood there, shoulders hunched, waiting for whatever punishment awaited him. Bradley was a fair man, but he was also practical. The town had rules, and stealing was stealing, regardless of age or circumstance. "What's your name, son?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years in law enforcement. The boy's lips moved, but no sound came out. Fear had stolen his voice just as surely as hunger had driven him to steal the bread. "He won't talk, Sheriff," Mrs. Henderson said, crossing her arms. "Been wandering around town for 3 days now. Somebody needs to teach him a lesson before he gets any bolder." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Red Mesa was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and strangers, especially young strangers who couldn't explain themselves, made people nervous. The boy's clothes were torn and dirty, his dark hair matted with dust and sweat, but his eyes held an intelligence that seemed older than his years. Sheriff Bradley made his decision with the heavy heart of a man who had seen too much of life's cruelty. The boy would receive 10 lashes in the town square, a punishment that served as both justice and warning to any other drifters who might think Red Mesa was an easy mark. It was harsh, but it was the law, and Bradley had sworn to uphold it regardless of his personal feelings. As they led the boy outside, his bare feet shuffling against the dirt road, an old pickup truck rumbled down Main Street, kicking up a cloud of red dust that seemed to swallow the afternoon sun. The truck belonged to Samuel Morgan, a rancher who had worked the same piece of land for 47 years. At 72, Samuel had seen drought and plenty, boom and bust, birth and death. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel as he brought the truck to a stop near the growing crowd. He had come to town for supplies, not entertainment, but something about the scene unfolding before him made him pause. The boy standing in the center of the crowd, small and defenseless, triggered a memory that Samuel had spent years trying to bury. "What's the commotion about, Tom?" Samuel asked as he approached the sheriff. His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had earned respect through decades of hard work and fair dealing. Bradley explained the situation, his tone suggesting that while he didn't enjoy what was about to happen, he saw no alternative. Samuel listened in silence, his steel-gray eyes never leaving the boy's face. There was something familiar about those green eyes, something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. The whipping post had been installed in Red Mesa's town square 50 years earlier, back when frontier justice was swift and public. It stood as a reminder of simpler times, when right and wrong were clearly defined and punishment was certain. The boy was led to the post, his hands bound with rough rope that chafed against his wrists. The crowd grew larger as word spread through the small town. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others out of a sense of civic duty, but all came expecting to see justice served in the harsh, unforgiving way of the desert. Samuel Morgan found himself pushing through the crowd, drawn by an instinct he couldn't explain. As he got closer to the boy, details became clearer that distance had obscured. The shape of the jaw, the curve of the nose, the way the boy held his head despite his fear. These features assembled themselves into a picture that made Samuel's blood run cold. His mind raced backward through the years, searching through memories he had tried so hard to forget, until he landed on a face that had haunted his dreams for over a decade. "Hold on there, Tom," Samuel called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Sheriff Bradley turned, surprised by the interruption. Samuel Morgan wasn't the type to interfere with the law, and his intervention at this moment seemed completely out of character. The old rancher approached the whipping post, his eyes locked on the boy's face, studying every feature with the intensity of a man trying to solve the most important puzzle of his life. The boy looked up at Samuel with those striking green eyes, and in that moment, both recognition and impossibility collided. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as memories flooded back, memories of his son Jacob, who had died in a car accident 13 years ago, along with his young wife Sarah. They had been driving to the hospital when Sarah went into labor, racing through a thunderstorm on dangerous mountain roads. The car had skidded off the road into Copper Creek, and by the time help arrived, it was too late to save them. But they had pulled a baby from the wreckage, a baby who had been declared dead at the scene. "What's your name, son?" Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The crowd had grown quiet, sensing that something important was happening, though they couldn't understand what. The boy stared at Samuel with a mixture of hope and confusion, still unable to find his voice. Samuel reached into his wallet with trembling hands and pulled out a photograph, creased and faded from years of handling. It was a picture of Jacob and Sarah, taken just months before their deaths, Sarah's hand resting on her pregnant belly. The sheriff stepped closer, curious about what had captured Samuel's attention so completely. "Sam, what's got into you? We need to get this over with." But Samuel wasn't listening. He was studying the boy's face, comparing it to the photograph, seeing similarities that couldn't be coincidence. The same green eyes that had belonged to Sarah. The same stubborn jawline that had marked 3 generations of Morgan men. The same small scar above the left eyebrow that Jacob had gotten as a child when he fell from his horse. "This boy," Samuel said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "This boy is my grandson." The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps. Mrs. Henderson pushed forward, her face red with indignation. "Samuel Morgan, you've lost your mind. That boy's nothing but a thief and a vagrant. He's not kin to anybody in this town." But Samuel ignored her protests, his attention focused entirely on the boy who might be the miracle he had never dared to hope for. Sheriff Bradley looked skeptical, but he had known Samuel for 20 years and had never known him to be a liar or a fool. "Sam, your son and daughter-in-law died in that accident 13 years ago. Their baby died with them. You know that. You were at the funeral." Samuel nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off the boy. "That's what we all believed, Tom. But what if we were wrong? What if somehow, someway, this child survived?" The boy's eyes widened as he listened to the conversation swirling around him. Something deep in his memory stirred, fragments of dreams or half-remembered experiences that had haunted him for as long as he could recall. Images of a woman with kind eyes singing lullabies. The sound of a man's laughter echoing through a house that felt like home. A dog named Rusty who would lick his face every morning. These memories had always seemed like fantasies, stories his mind had created to fill the void left by parents he had never known. Samuel untied the ropes that bound the boy's hands, ignoring the protests from the crowd. "Tom, I need to take this boy home. I need to find out the truth." Sheriff Bradley hesitated, caught between duty and friendship, between law and the possibility of something miraculous. The boy had committed a crime, and justice demanded punishment. But if Samuel was right, if this child was really his grandson, then everything changed. "The boy still stole bread, Sam," Bradley said reluctantly. Law's the law, regardless of who he might be. Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out a $20 bill, more than enough to cover the cost of a loaf of bread and any damages. Then consider this payment for what he took and compensation for Mrs. Henderson's trouble. He handed the money to the sheriff, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed that their entertainment had been canceled, but buzzing with excitement over this unexpected turn of events. Red Mesa hadn't seen drama like this in years, and the story would be told and retold in every kitchen and coffee shop in town. Some believed Samuel had lost his mind in his old age. Others thought he was being fooled by a clever con artist. But a few remembered the night 13 years ago when Jacob and Sarah Morgan had died, and they wondered if perhaps the desert had finally decided to give back something it had taken. Samuel led the boy to his pickup truck, moving slowly to avoid frightening him further. The child climbed into the passenger seat, his green eyes taking in everything around him with a mixture of wonder and wariness. Samuel started the engine and began the drive back to his ranch, his mind racing with questions and possibilities. How had the boy survived? Where had he been all these years? Who had raised him? And why had he ended up alone and hungry in Red Mesa? The ranch came into view as they crested the hill overlooking Morgan Valley, 15,000 acres of rugged beauty that had been in Samuel's family for 3 generations. The old house sat in a grove of cottonwood trees, its white paint peeling but its bones still strong. Behind it stood the barn where Samuel had taught Jacob to ride, the corral where they had broken horses together, and the cemetery where Jacob and Sarah lay buried beneath matching headstones. As they pulled up to the house, an old border collie came running from the porch, barking with excitement. The dog was Rusty's grandson, also named Rusty, and he had the same friendly disposition as his predecessor. The boy's eyes lit up when he saw the dog, and for the first time since Samuel had found him, a smile crossed his face. Rusty, he whispered, the first word he had spoken all day. Samuel's heart nearly stopped. That dog had been dead for 10 years, but somehow this boy knew his name. Inside the house, Samuel showed the boy to Jacob's old room, which he had kept exactly as it was the day his son died. The walls were covered with rodeo ribbons and school photographs, a shrine to a life cut short. The boy stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room with an expression Samuel couldn't quite read. Then, slowly, he walked to the desk and picked up a small wooden horse that Jacob had carved when he was 12 years old. I remember this, the boy said softly, turning the horse over in his hands. Someone made this for me when I was little. I used to play with it every day. Samuel sat down heavily in Jacob's desk chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what he was hearing. If this boy remembered the wooden horse, if he somehow knew about Rusty, then perhaps the impossible was true. Perhaps his grandson had somehow survived that terrible night 13 years ago. Over dinner, Samuel gently coaxed the boy's story from him. His name was Danny, though he wasn't sure if that was his real name or something the people at the orphanage had called him. He had no memory of his early years, just fragments and impressions that felt more like dreams than reality. The orphanage had burned down when he was 10, and he had been moved from one foster home to another, each one worse than the last. Finally, he had run away, determined to find the place he saw in his dreams, the place with the white house and the cottonwood trees. Samuel listened with growing amazement and heartbreak. The boy's story explained so much: how he had survived, why he had no memory of his early years, why he had ended up in Red Mesa. But it also raised new questions. If Danny was really his grandson, why had the authorities declared him dead? What had happened in those crucial hours after the accident that had led to such a tragic mistake? That night, Samuel called his old friend Dr. Marcus Webb, who had been the medical examiner 13 years ago when Jacob and Sarah died. Webb was retired now, living in Phoenix, but he remembered the case clearly. Sam, I examined that baby myself. He was dead when they brought him in. No pulse, no breathing, nothing. I signed the death certificate personally. Samuel explained about Danny, about the memories and the resemblances, and asked Webb to come to the ranch to see for himself. Dr. Webb arrived the next morning, a silver-haired man in his 70s who moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent his career dealing with life and death. He examined Danny thoroughly, checking for identifying marks, measuring proportions, comparing features to the old photographs Samuel had saved. When he was finished, he sat back with a look of utter bewilderment on his face. "Sam, I don't understand it, but this boy could very well be your grandson. The bone structure matches, the eye color is identical, and there's that distinctive scar above his left eyebrow. But I examined that baby myself 13 years ago. I would have staked my career on the fact that he was dead." Webb paused, struggling with implications that challenged everything he thought he knew about his profession. Unless what, Marcus?" Samuel pressed. Webb rubbed his forehead, trying to organize thoughts that seemed to defy logic. "There's a condition called apparent death, where the body's vital signs become so weak that they're undetectable without sophisticated equipment. It's extremely rare, especially in infants, but it can happen in cases of severe trauma and hypothermia. If the baby was in the cold water for an extended period, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was almost too incredible to believe. Danny had been declared dead because his vital signs had been undetectable after being submerged in the freezing creek water. But somehow, perhaps because of his infant metabolism and the protective effects of hypothermia, he had survived. Someone at the hospital or the morgue must have discovered he was alive, but instead of reporting the mistake, they had covered it up and placed him in the foster care system. Samuel spent the next week making phone calls and following paper trails, trying to uncover the truth about what had happened 13 years ago. What he discovered was a conspiracy of silence and bureaucratic incompetence that had robbed him of his grandson and robbed Danny of his family. A night shift orderly at the hospital had found Danny breathing in the morgue and, panicking about the implications of the mistake, had contacted a friend who worked in social services. Together, they had falsified documents and placed Danny in the system under a new identity, hoping to avoid the lawsuits and investigations that would have followed if the truth had come out. The orderly had died years ago, but the social worker was still alive, living in Tucson under a cloud of guilt that had haunted her every day since. When Samuel confronted her, she broke down and confessed everything. She had convinced herself that she was saving the boy from a life of wealth and privilege that would corrupt him. But the truth was simpler and more selfish. She had been afraid of losing her job and possibly facing criminal charges. With the truth finally revealed, Samuel began the legal process of establishing Danny's true identity and claiming custody of his grandson. It would take months of court hearings and DNA tests, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Danny belonged at the ranch, with the family he had been separated from through tragedy and human error. During those months of waiting, Samuel and Danny grew closer every day. The old rancher taught his grandson to ride horses and mend fences, to read the weather and understand the rhythms of ranch life. Danny's memories gradually returned as he reconnected with the place where he had been born. He remembered his parents now, not clearly but in flashes of warmth and love that filled some of the empty spaces in his heart. The people of Red Mesa watched this transformation with amazement and growing acceptance. The boy who had been nothing but a thief and a vagrant was revealed to be one of their own, the heir to one of the most respected families in the county. Mrs. Henderson, who had been among his harshest critics, became one of his strongest supporters, often bringing him cookies and asking about his progress in school. Sheriff Bradley reflected on the events that had brought Danny home and marveled at the hand of Providence that had guided the boy to Red Mesa at exactly the right moment. If Samuel hadn't been in town that day, if he hadn't seen something familiar in the boy's face, Danny might have received his punishment and moved on, lost forever to the family that had mourned him for 13 years. On Danny's 14th birthday, Samuel took him to the cemetery where Jacob and Sarah were buried. They stood together in the shade of the old oak tree, grandfather and grandson united by loss and love, by tragedy and miracle. Samuel told Danny stories about his parents, helping him understand the people he had been too young to remember. "They loved you more than life itself," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "And they would be so proud of the young man you're becoming." Danny placed flowers on his parents' graves, finally able to say goodbye to people he had never really known but had always carried in his heart. The hole in his identity had been filled, the questions about his origins answered. He was Daniel Jacob Morgan, grandson of Samuel Morgan, son of Jacob and Sarah, heir to a legacy of courage and determination that stretched back 3 generations. As they walked back to the truck, Samuel put his arm around his grandson's shoulders. "You know, son, when I first saw you in that town square, I thought I was looking at a ghost. Now I realize I was looking at the future." Danny smiled up at his grandfather, secure in the knowledge that he had finally found where he belonged, that he was home at last. The ranch prospered under their partnership, grandfather passing down wisdom to grandson, tradition flowing from one generation to the next like water, finding its natural course. The boy who had once been whipped for stealing bread became a pillar of the Red Mesa community, his story serving as a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary miracles come disguised as ordinary tragedies. Years later, when Danny had grown into a man and had children of his own, he would tell them the story of how their great-grandfather had seen past appearances to the truth beneath, how love had triumphed over loss, how a family separated by tragedy had been reunited by faith. And in the telling, the miracle would live on, proof that sometimes the desert gives back what it has taken, that sometimes the lost can be found, and that sometimes an old rancher's instinct can see what everyone else has missed. The White House still stands in Morgan Valley, surrounded by cottonwood trees, home to 4 generations of Morgans and countless memories of love, loss, and redemption. The story of Danny Morgan became legend in Red Mesa, told and retold until it became part of the town's identity, a testament to the power of family and the persistence of hope even in the darkest times.